Mike Reynolds, in a different conversation, you and I talked about your two deployments to the Middle East, one with the Marine Corps to Kuwait following the Gulf War of the early 90s, the beginning of the 1990s. And then we talked about your deployment to Iraq with the Arkansas National Guard, 2004, 2005. Another thing that you were involved in is something that you're not able to say a lot about. Just there are restrictions put on what you can say, and then there are a lot of things that you don't want to talk about. You just don't want to talk about. But I mean, and this is the operation in Somalia. So I'm not interested in prying, but you just don't have many opportunities to talk to service members who deployed to Somalia. So what are you willing to say about Somalia?
Mogadishu is
the capital of Somalia.
It's the capital of Somalia, and if you know that African history, Somalia has always been a hotbed of terrorist activity, and their government deteriorated over the course of the 80s and 90s to the point where basically you had a lot of warlords that took over. And what we were at the time, the U.S. government was doing, and many other countries were trying to aid those people. They were starving to death, and we were distributing aid there. But the problem with distributing aid in Somalia was that there were too many people who had their hands in the pie that were getting the food and then using it as a bargaining chip, warlords, if you would. And our presence there was there just mainly for assistance. We were already on a float to the Middle East, or in the Marine Corps we call it a float, deployment to the Mediterranean. And we were there simply for assistance for the Army units and the UN forces that were there. We provided, certain elements of their relief if they needed it. And of course the Army units that were involved in the ground operations there were involved in trying to take down a lot of the
warlords.
The warlords, yes, they were doing that.
And so the Army was there not as a combatant force, but to try to make sure that the food was getting to the people who are actually starving to death.
The bulk of the Army position, forces there were, and the bulk of any other forces there were there to try to ensure the delivery of aid. But there were also forces within the U.S. military that were there, and other militaries as well, that were there to try to take out some of the problems that they had, because
these would be the special forces.
That'd be the special forces guys and stuff. And I wasn't involved in that kind of operation. So
was this 92?
93.
93. You were there how long?
We weren't even there 90 days. We were just there as part of a rotation that we were already on. Every year, and with the Marines, not every year I did it, but every year there's a Marine Air Ground Task Force that goes on a cruise with the Navy. You're just the ground combat force of the Navy, and they do different cruises in different places. There's Westpacks in the Pacific, and there's med floats.
The med cruises.
That's right, exactly. And you're just that ground combat arm, and occasionally we offload and do training in different places, and we were there for their support. We just happened to be in the neighborhood when things were going not the way they wanted them to, so we were there for support.
Now, you were there before the Black Hawk Down incident?
The dates would be we were there before that. It was shortly. Well, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Maybe a month or two prior to the activity that happened and that was depicted in that movie. It was. I mean, everybody in the military heard about that. That was something we all kind of had a thought process of knowing that it happened. But as far as us being involved in anything like that, I was not involved in anything like that.
Did you go into the city of Mogadishu itself? So you spent time in Baghdad, and in a different conversation, you said that you were in some pretty rough neighborhoods in Baghdad. Compare the two cities, Mogadishu, Baghdad.
Mogadishu was far worse than what Baghdad was, as far as the squalor that people lived in and the conditions and their living conditions. They were similar. I mean, a lot of similarities to it, but I would say that if you could say which one was worse, I would say Mogadishu was far worse, and I think it probably still is to this day, just because, I don't know, it's like we just forgot that was necessary, or it wasn't profitable, or whatever the case was. We didn't have, it wasn't directly affecting Americans, so we didn't put a lot of effort into that.
Describe what is it that you saw in Mogadishu that leads you to say, compared to compared to, wartime
yeah.
Baghdad, Mogadishu is actually in much
Occasionally
worse.
they still had running water in Baghdad, and
Yeah.
occasionally, most of the time, they still had rudimentary electrical services, and they had rudimentary sanitation of some type.
Yeah.
And they had food. In Mogadishu, you didn't see that. You saw masses of people who were starving.
You saw that.
Very, very limited very, very limited public services, if any public services at all.
I mean, it's a country that at that time, I think still doesn't, has a government on paper, but in actuality doesn't have a government. Was that obvious to you?
That was very obvious. I mean, that was, if I had the most guns in this neighborhood, I'm in charge. And if you cross this street at this intersection and in this other neighborhood, I've got the most guns over here and I'm in charge. It was just one of those things where I'm controlling the food. The UN's bringing food to me, and I'm going to control who gets it. And by controlling who gets it, I control my loyalty. You're buying people's loyalty by keeping them from starving, but then it's just barely above starving. So if you look at it like that, then for me, that makes Mogadishu far worse, because the quality of life for the individual people was far worse on a day-to-day basis.
And when you're looking at the people, you could tell that there was starvation of food.
That was obvious. Everybody's seen the World Children's Fund, pictures of the starving children in Africa, and everybody looked that way. There was a few that didn't, but by and large, most people, you could tell they were in bad shape, and that they needed far more help than they were going to get, and what their mortality rate was, I couldn't tell you that. I didn't observe that. Wasn't involved in enough stuff to really tell you much more than it's just a basic observation to say, hey, and these folks are in really bad shape, and this is not somewhere I want to be, and I'd really like to leave right now if you don't mind.
I'll bet. Are you allowed to say what kind of work you did in Mogadishu?
No, we were just helping out the security forces is really all that our units were even involved in.
Yeah.
At that time, I was with a tank battalion, and we didn't have a role to play at all because there were no armored vehicles on the ground there. There was no commitment of armored forces. So, not from us. There could have been, other coalition members there may have had some armor on the ground, but for the most part, no.
Yeah. When the whole incident went down, not long after you left, the whole incident that we now refer to as the Black Hawk Down.
Right.
Incident. You know what that place looks like. You know what it smells like. You know what the air feels like. Do you remember kind of what went through your mind when you heard about that?
I just thought those guys were, they were just in a bad situation. I think there was a lot of miscommunication. They just don't. I don't know. The commanders had established, and this is obvious to somebody who's in the military, they had established a pattern of behavior. And
the Somalis or
the Americans had
the
established
Americans.
a pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
And obviously that pattern of behavior, the Somalis picked up on it, and I think we underestimated them.
You mean like convoy routes and
right,
things like that?
Convoy routes and the way they were doing their business. I think they underestimated the Somalis' ability to play ball if they knew the rules.
Yeah.
Or play ball and modify the rules. So to some degree, I think it was an underestimation of the enemy and overconfidence on the part of the military. And we tended to be that way. No matter where we go, we tend to be overconfident sometimes. We're the big boys. We're the NFL, and these guys are high school players. We think that.
Yeah.
But what we always tend to forget, and it's probably historically accurate to say this in any war, is that we're playing ball in their neighborhood. And when you play ball in somebody's neighborhood, you have to play by their rules.
Yeah.
And we don't always dictate the rules.
Yeah.
So, it's unfortunate that the things that happened there happened.
Yeah.
But it's part of war, and we get involved in things sometimes, and that's what we have to bear the consequences of it.
Yeah. I think this is the last question. When you were in Mogadishu, just in that country, did you see a lot of young men walking around with AKs? Did you see a lot of guys walking around with weapons? And
it was probably more commonplace than I would have thought, but I didn't have any, there was nothing for me to gauge it against. What was it like before this started happening versus what it's like now? So, you see it, and I didn't really see that many people walking around with weapons to be honest with you. It didn't seem like a vast majority of it, but again, compare that to Baghdad. You walk into a house and just the people sitting in the living room didn't have an AK on them, but if you asked them, they'd tell you it was in the closet in the bedroom. Some of them wouldn't tell you it was in the closet in the bedroom. You had to go search for it, and we didn't take it away from them. How do you take away somebody's ability to defend themselves? I mean, we think of things differently in the United States because everybody in the United States, when I say everybody, but there's a large gun population in the United States, and people think of it. We have sporting uses for them. We have defense uses for them.
Yeah.
In the places like that, where there is no such thing as a Second Amendment, they're there. Those people, if they don't have that gun, they may not eat, or somebody may come kidnap them. Whatever the case is, there's a reasoning behind it, and maybe to keep their government from oppressing them. But I don't think that would.
Sure.
If it came to fight or flight, most of those people will fly.
So obviously there were a lot of guns there, but what you're saying, kind of the image a person might have that every 14-year-old's walking around with an AK, that's not what
there's
you
probably
saw.
certain areas of that city that were correct, that might have been correct. But what I saw physically myself, no, I wouldn't say that every person that was walking down the street had a gun. No, and it wasn't that way in Baghdad either. Now, would you find them behind every door? Maybe. And then that may have been true in some of the shanties that were, I drove by in Mogadishu, but I didn't stop to look. That wasn't my prerogative. It wasn't our mission.
Yeah.
So we just did what we were there to do as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and tried not to hurt anybody, and tried not to get any of our people hurt, which we did not have anybody hurt. So we were effective.
And you were glad to clear out after 3 months.
I was more than happy because the place, yes, it did. It had its own odor. It had its own taste. Everything about it was unique. But if you go to enough third world countries, it becomes pattern. There's a pattern there. I mean,
you see commonalities.
It's pretty common regardless of where you might be standing. And the people may believe differently or speak differently, but their situation, or sanitation wise and living conditions wise, it can be the same in a lot of different places.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah.
And you see it. It's not something that we would be familiar with. It would be revolting to our senses as Americans.
Yeah.
And again, that's one of those situations where we're trying to make our way of life fit with a culture that doesn't understand it. So
yeah.
Unfortunately, we still bear the consequences of that too, because we still have Somalis that think it's a better idea to try to steal a ship than it is to organize and form a government. And
the pirates. That's right. Well, Mike, listening to you talk, I'm reminded of something. That an Army officer, I think, said to me, and I've said it a lot, and I think it's true, that most of us, I was in the military, but peacetime Navy, but most of us read about history as it happens, and in the newspaper, we watch newscasts. But if you're in the military, you have a good chance of actually participating in history, and you certainly did. I mean, the Gulf War. The situation in Iraq in 2004, 2005. I mean, there are a very small number of Americans who know what Somalia is like. And the only, when Americans think of Somalia, mostly they're going to think of the Black Hawk Down incident.
And I think that's probably pretty representative of it, of what occurred there from a combat situation. But I think you have to look past what was happening with that to understand why we were there to begin with and what our mission was. We were trying to help people. Yeah. And unfortunately, sometimes that, when we try to help, there's different ways to help people. And that particular way may not have been the most productive, but it was what was effective at the time, and that was what the military leadership and the political leadership of the United States felt like was the most important way to go about it. So as a military member, my job is to go out there and support it, and do the best I can do and try to bring all my guys home.
I hear you.
That's I think it's, as a military leader anyway, that's all any of us can do, is try to do the best that we can do and make sure that America's interests are taken care of, or that we're doing what's, support our interests and policies and bring our people home. Unfortunately, war is a necessity at some points in time. Hopefully we never have to deal with it again. Hopefully my children or your children never have to deal with that. But unfortunately, the reality is they probably will, and then maybe they'll be ready for it.
Well, I appreciate that you were there when the country called in these three operations, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to share with us some of your memories. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me that opportunity.